had the pleasure of meeting Rena Detrixhe last month when she was here installing her beautiful red dirt rug in our ephemera exhibit downstairs. And when we made our appointment to meet, I walked over to the museum and she was coming out of the gallery, and I knew she had been working for days with this red dirt that she had brought up from Oklahoma. And she stepped out of the gallery and she was dressed in all white. And when she walked out, I was immediately struck with the realization that this young woman is very much like her artworks. She has this wonderful understated beauty and simplicity, which you'll see in a few minutes with her artwork, as well as a great sense of profundity and depth. Rena Detrixhe is in her second year of an artist fellowship in Tulsa, but she's originally from Kansas, and she earned a BFA in expanded media and art history from KU. Yay, art history. In 2013, where she received numerous awards and scholarships, and her education was further enhanced with a semester abroad in Seoul, Korea. In 2015, Rena was awarded a studio residency with the Charlotte Street Foundation here in Kansas City. Additionally, Rena Detrixhe has exhibited in many group and solo exhibitions, to include the Paragraph Gallery in Kansas City, the Spencer Museum of Art in Lawrence, the Grand Rapids Public Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the Hoffman Gallery in Portland, Oregon, the Taubman Museum in Roanoke, Virginia, the Form and Concept Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the Kansas City Art Institute's Crossroads Gallery. Our red dirt rug is an excellent example of the fleeting quality of many of Rita's works and her ability to use natural materials in such a way that the presence of humanity is directly recognized as well. Using items that are typically discarded or disregarded, such as tea bags, dryer sheets, seed pods, or dirt, Rena Detrixhe presents to the viewer a temporary snapshot of nature imprinted by humankind. I know you're going to thoroughly enjoy many of Rena's works that she'll show you here in a few minutes. I find them all simply stunning. Please welcome Rena Detrixhe.
Hello. Thank you all for coming. Thanks, Allison, for that introduction. It is really, really wonderful to be at the Nerman today. This is one of my favorite places. And I want to start off just by saying a few thank yous and a few acknowledgments. I want to say thank you to Bruce Hartman for inviting me to be a part of this beautiful exhibition. So thrilled to be here. And I want to mention a few influential women that are also showing at this museum right now, who it's really just an honor to be in proximity to. I'm so happy to be in the same room as Susan White and her beautiful thorn installation, River of Solace, River of Hope. Across the atrium, we have May Tveit, who teaches at my alma mater, the University of Kansas, and I'm a big fan of her work. It's really amazing to be in her proximity as well. And then tonight, as Catherine was saying, we have a show opening this evening as well of the Charlotte Street Fellows, including one of my friends and mentors, Karen McCoy. And it's really just quite a delight to have our work in the same space in this museum. So thank you, Bruce. I grew up about 15 miles south of a little boom town called Russell, Kansas. It's a farming and agricultural community. And I lived in about 3 old limestone houses by the age of 6. When my parents purchased this house, where I would spend most of my childhood, it was just the limestone frame of a house. It had holes for windows, dirt for floors, didn't have a bathroom. Before we moved in, they would work on it a lot. They fixed it up and made it livable. They made it comfortable. They added a bathroom. Thanks in large part to my big sister, who was a teenager at the time. And so I spend a lot of time outside, collecting things, picking up stones and sticks and bones. And for instance, while I was playing, my parents were repairing the mortar of this house brick by brick by hand. And so I won't try to give you my whole life story in 15 or 20 minutes, but I start here because this place has really shaped the way that I see the world, the way I approach material and process and work. I've developed a reverence for nature, for slow and careful labor, and a deep connection to place. And when I say a deep connection to place, for example, I was aware on some level, even as a child, that the walls of my house had embedded in them millions-year-old fossils in this limestone. My work often begins with collected or scavenged materials. I'm guided by the nature of the material, and I spend time with it until my hands develop a means to respond. Sometimes objects lay dormant in my studio for years until an idea surfaces. Most often, an idea will be the impetus for working with a certain material. The forms I create are informed by the intrinsic and poetic quality that live in these things, like seeds, petals, berries, and soil. So this is an image of the first rug that I ever made several years ago. The spiky fruit of sweet gum tree are collected, sorted, threaded together to become the form of a rug. The subtle variation in color is a result of different seasons, different years. They might resemble both tree rings or a braided or woven rug. The textile form is something that I return to often. It brings these materials into the realm of the domestic or the familiar, but also these are objects that we have a personal reverence for. Handmade objects that we treasure for their sentimental, aesthetic, or historical value. I'm interested in the tactility, the relationship to the hand, to time, and the process involved. And I liken my process in the studio to these meticulous hand labors like weaving, crochet, and embroidery. This piece is entitled Heirloom, and it's a tablecloth made of gathered seeds. I'm as interested in the act of collecting as the act of making. And as a sort of experimental performance or a challenge to myself, I once set out to pick every berry off of a single tree. It was also at a busy bus stop, so I had a large audience for this performance. I would eventually fail this experiment. I did not succeed in stripping every berry off of this tree due to some combination of cold weather, insufficient ladder, and potential reprimand. I did, however, succeed in stripping the lower branches of the tree, creating sort of a horizon line. Originally, I didn't have any intention of ever using this material that I collected. In fact, I challenged myself to focus just on the act of collecting. Of course, I would eventually fail that challenge as well. The berries sat and dried in my studio for a couple of years, and I would go back and visit this tree occasionally. And upon visiting it one time, I found that there was all this construction of the sidewalk and street, and the tree had been totally removed. So at that point, I gave myself permission to return to this material. It occurred to me that the material I collected, it's actually a crabapple tree, so they're not really berries, but they look more like a berry than an apple. So it occurred to me that this might be the only remains of this tree, and probably no one would even remember that it was there aside from me and maybe a few people who worked in that building. And certainly no one else had this intimate relationship with the tree. And so I created a piece that became a memory of that tree and a retracing of the act of collecting the fruit, a sort of elegy. I drilled a tiny hole in each berry, threaded them together, making a map-like structure reminiscent of those lower branches. By the time the piece was complete, each individual piece of fruit had passed through my hands at least 3 times, once when plucked, again when drilled, and again when threaded. The making of this work also coincided with a loss in my family, and I began to treat the material as though it were the last reminders of a loved one. I obsessively saved each fallen stem and bits of tiny branch, all the broken berry pieces, and even the dust from drilling each hole. And these remnants became a part of the piece as well. So these themes of loss and memory and elegy in relation to process, material, and labor were becoming a part of my language. In the fall of 2015, I was accepted into a residency program, a 1 to 3 year fellowship in Oklahoma called the Tulsa Artist Fellowship. For me, this long-term residency was an opportunity to really root in a place, to research, to try and fail and experiment and create new work. So as an artist, I set about getting to know this place I was in. I knew a little, but I began to really dig into the history and began to understand what has taken place on this ground, and also what's taken place to this ground and deep beneath this ground. Oklahoma is known for the oil and natural gas industry. It's home to the pipeline crossroads of the world in Cushing, Oklahoma. That's what this top image is from. More recently, due to fracking, it has become known for earthquakes. It surpassed California in seismic activity in 2015. So I just paired this image together to kind of show the contrast of sort of the bucolic Oklahoma and also this major industry. But it occurred to me that the scale might be kind of deceiving. One of these oil storage containers could fit all of those buffalo inside of it pretty comfortably. Oklahoma was one of the last states to enter the Union, and it's only been a state for a little over 100 years. It was Indian territory for many years. Many tribes were relocated here. The Trail of Tears ended in Oklahoma, but this is just one of many relocations. As a result, there are 39 federally recognized tribes in Oklahoma, and even more that are not federally recognized. And so I'd like to just list these names as a way of recognizing them. And I apologize, I'll do my best on pronunciation. Absentee Shawnee, Alabama, Apache, Caddo, Cherokee, Cheyenne and Arapaho, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Citizen Potawatomi, Comanche, Delaware Nation, Delaware Tribe, Eastern Shawnee, Fort Sill Apache, Iowa, Kaw, Kyaligi, Kickapoo, Kiowa, Miami, Modoc, Muskogee Creek, Osage, Otoe, Missouri, Ottawa, Pawnee, Peoria, Ponca, Quapaw, Sac and Fox, Seminole, Seneca, Cayuga, Shawnee, Laploco, Tonkawa, United Keetoowah, Wichita, Wyandotte. To draw a comparison, Kansas has 2 federally recognized tribes, the Kickapoo and the Prairie Band of the Potawatomi. For my residency, I was transplanted to downtown Tulsa, a fairly recently redeveloped arts district. This is a map of my neighborhood. So the map on the right shows the historic neighborhood of Greenwood, which was a famous historic black neighborhood in Tulsa. It was burned to the ground in 1921 in what's known as the Tulsa Race Riot, in which a white mob looted and burned nearly all the houses and businesses of the prominent, vibrant black neighborhood. At least 300 people were killed. It was the deadliest act of racial violence in our country's history. So the image on the left is a current map of the neighborhood, and I live and work in what's until recently been known as the Brady Arts District. The Brady Arts District is named after a man named Tate Brady, who is one of the founders of Tulsa, a known member of the KKK, and one of the orchestrators of the massacre known as the Tulsa Race Riot. A little strip of yellow is where the current Arts District and historic Greenwood overlap, and then the red arrow in both images is where my studio is located. So I share these things not to be anecdotal, but because living here in the location of this history in a neighborhood that's very much still reckoning has informed my practice and my thinking immensely. Add to that I moved here in January of 2016, the beginning of a deeply emotional and turbulent political year. All this to say that Oklahoma is challenging. It's complicated. It's a place of great pride and beauty and resilience, and also profound sorrow. Histories seem to sit close to the surface, even if they've been swept under the rug. And these histories and how they relate to both land and to people, I think, speak to a larger issue of how we as Americans or we as humans relate to our world. The writer Rilla Askew, who also wrote the text for my work in this show, writes the following about her home state. This is a quote from her book, her recent book of essays titled Most American: Notes from a Wounded Place. Too Southern to be Midwestern, too Western to be Southern, too Midwestern to be purely Southwestern, Oklahoma has kept the secret of its identity as a chameleon does. Oklahoma's history is a compressed, ironically inverted miniature of the national narrative, unfolding in a matter of days and weeks and months, sometimes hours rather than decades, beginning with the Trail of Tears. In terms of numbers and attitude and collective forgetfulness, Oklahoma is predominantly white. It is profoundly religious, politically conservative, inextricably rooted to the land. And this land, a vast skyscape of mountains and lakes and prairies, is peopled with descendants of pioneers and mountain folk, slaves and Indians, entrepreneurs and oil barons, coal miners, immigrants, farmers, cowboys, and outlaws. An inheritance that is like the rest of the country's, except that in Oklahoma, we're hardly 100 years removed from these roots. So, before I ever moved to Oklahoma, I was told about its red dirt. Red dirt is to Oklahoma as the Rocky Mountains are to Colorado, or as the prairie is to Kansas. Red dirt might be the defining geographical feature of Oklahoma, but it's also a signifier. It's a symbol, it's an expression, it's part of the language. The name Oklahoma comes from two Choctaw words, Okla meaning red and Huma meaning people. Businesses use red dirt in their names. Red dirt music is rooted in Oklahoma. Red dirt is ubiquitous. It is understood. It symbolizes grit and perseverance, sorrow and pain, spirit and resilience. So as an artist, as someone who's sensitive to both place and to material, I was drawn to this rich red soil, both for its beauty but also for its symbolic properties and the memories that it holds. I should also mention that my dad worked as a soil conservation technician for 30 years, and my mother is a ceramicist, so that may have something to do with it as well. While walking, I noticed footprints on trails and recognized these patterns as indicators of human presence. It would occur to me later that these physical marks in the soil were both the result of immediate impact, the footprint, and also the result of repeated impact over time. The heavily trafficked path had been tamped and crushed, so the soil was a fine, soft dust, allowing the footprint to be crisp and visible. I began developing a way to hone this type of mark making, a way of speaking to both the physical memory of the soil in this immediate mark, and also the deeper memories held within the soil. Soil does have a memory, scientifically, biologically, but also spiritually and emotionally. There's a reason that we say something happened on our soil. So I harvest this earth, transport it to my studio, and began processing. I grind and sift meticulously by hand or with a small grinding tool. I sift through various levels of screen and last through a layer of silk organza. As I'm processing this soil physically, I'm also processing through research the histories and memories that are embedded in this material. So it's the soil of the Dust Bowl, which we know as the worst man-made ecological disaster in our country's history. It holds the memories of settlers marching with their families and animals, of land runs, of herds of bison, of drilling and fracking and earthquakes. I take the soles of shoes and I dissect their patterns, cut them apart, and use these shapes to design an ornate carpet. From a Western perspective, this object is decoration. It's a symbol of value, of wealth, and opulence. It's a utilitarian object to be used, something to own, something to make beautiful, something to cover over. And the woven rug is the result of many hours of careful labor. The work is meditative and slow. I spend hours spreading the soil in a thin layer and carefully stamping the surface until a pattern is slowly revealed on the surface. I'll show just a couple seconds of a time lapse here. This is documentation of a recent installation that I did in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the rug was 1,000 square feet in size. It took about 3 weeks to install. Try to get to a point where the light rakes across and you can get a sense of the time. So in doing this, I'm aware of each gesture, the amount of pressure that each stamp requires. There's a different hand and a different feel to each tool that I'm using. I'm aware of each movement of my body in relation to the soil. I describe this piece as a meditation on the landscape, but it's also a gesture. So through this gesture and this touch, it's suggesting a sensitivity and perhaps a slower, more subtle or gentle kind of action. There's a carefulness and a slowness involved that might be contrary to how we typically relate to our surroundings. And it offers a sense of time or a scale of time that we don't often afford ourselves, or that we aren't allowed to experience typically in our daily lives. I'll just let that run through. So it asks, what if we each could spend hundreds of hours getting to know our surroundings? I've started to open my process to the public so that this gestural, performative aspect of the work is made visible. This is more documentation from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then once the work is complete, viewers are invited to walk around the piece and experience it up close. In this case, we didn't have any stanchions around the piece, and there was some signage up, but visitors were more or less just allowed to interact with the piece as they would. I've been surprised and sort of charmed by all the different ways that people view the work. Some people come and sit for a long time. This guy on the left here brought binoculars. That was really cool. The rug is impermanent and malleable by design. So sometimes the work is stepped on by both humans and insects. Interruptions occur, and I have come to expect them. You might even say that I invite them. The work is, like I said, sometimes stepped on by insects. This is some kind of little bug. And the image on the right here shows a harsh line where someone decided to see what would happen when they rolled a coin. Okay, I'm almost done. I think I'm about time's up, but like I said, the work is ephemeral, and after the exhibition, it's swept away. I'm interested in this temporality and temporariness in relation to a landscape, especially one that's been drastically altered by human presence. I believe that that impermanence and the anticipation of loss, while uncomfortable, is actually an important feeling to sit with. I've begun to incorporate a closing meditation or reflection when the work is removed. Participants are invited to reflect on the work, the memories embedded in the soil, the idea of impermanence in our lives and in relation to the earth, to consider the ways that we ascribe value to objects and to land, to contemplate loss. And then we sweep the soil together. These closing gestures are not all sorrow and loss. There is an element of play and joy and letting go. Sometimes we feel the earth with our hands and feet, but always with intention. Children are especially helpful in this process. So the questions that continue to guide this work are, can beauty and sorrow exist simultaneously? What are the memories embedded in this material, and how can we respond to them and honor them? How have we as humans altered and impacted our environment, and is there an alternative to how we relate to our world? So I'll leave you with this very, very brief meditation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Samuel Davis from the ceramics department here at JCCC, and it's my great pleasure to introduce another artist whose work is also included in the show downstairs, entitled Ephemera. Kahlil Robert Irving is a multimedia artist currently living and working in St. Louis, Missouri. In 2015, Kahlil received his BFA in Art History and Ceramics, woohoo ceramics, from the Kansas City Art Institute. In May of 2017, Irving earned his Master of Fine Arts at Washington University of St. Louis, where he was also a Chancellor's Graduate Fellow. He is currently the 2017-2018 Alice C. Cole Fellow at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. Irving has studied abroad in Israel, the Czech Republic, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and Hungary, a place to which he recently returned as a resident artist at the University of Pest. His work has been exhibited internationally and across the United States. He has upcoming exhibitions in Port Chester, New York, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Wellesley, Massachusetts, and Notre Dame, Indiana. Most recently, his practice has involved making objects that are to challenge constructs around identity and culture in Western civilization. He wants to challenge realities of racism, structural barriers that separate communities, and objects that exist within the history of the decorative arts. Please join me in welcoming Kahlil Robert Irving.
That's quite an introduction. Hopefully I can share some good stuff with everybody today. I really want to say thanks to Bruce. Bruce saw my work at the Art Institute auction earlier this year, and he messaged me. He's like, hey, Kahlil, I'm coming to St. Louis. I want to see your work. And I was like, wow, oh shit. Well, I need to get to work then. But I was actually working on an exhibition with Fodi Giovannis and the staff at Calicoon Fine Arts in New York City, so I had the capacity to take on the project to work with Bruce here at the Nelson or the Nerman and everyone here. And so my name is Kahlil Robert Irving, and as all the things that Sam said for me, it's a pleasure to be here. And I wanted to say thanks to Ari Fish, one of my biggest fans and my mentor and one of my bestest friends, and she's been helping me and pushed me this whole time. And like getting to graduate school was the help of Ari Fish. Getting to manage all of these things is because I have this foundation and this grounding and community and teamwork. And I'm so glad that she was able to move her schedule to be here with us today. I'm just going to show some slides of like my biography and where I come from and what I've done, and then kind of show you some of Hungary, some of Israel, and then show you about the work that was exhibited in New York City. In 1997, I moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and this is one of the first artworks that I've seen at the St. Louis Art Museum as a part of an exhibition on masks. I mean, I was 7, and I was quite small. I was really intimidated by these costumes and cultural artifacts that were standing still, that sooner or later I would learn that those objects aren't meant to stand still, but they're supposed to be in movement. This is me when I was 11, and this is the year before I started making things out of clay. And this is also it's a very important year in my life, so I kind of show this slide to kind of show perspective in relation to where I was or who I was when I was younger to who I am now. And this is the last year I saw my mother. And it's a really kind of grounding place because it would kind of come into play and affect me later on. This is the first exhibition of contemporary art that I saw. It's Getty Siboni at the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis. And next door at the Pulitzer Art Foundation was Gordon Matta Clark. This is a Gordon Matta Clark sculpture where it's kind of these trash things and things that he amassed off the street that then he would put in baking trays and put into the kiln and kind of let be there for days on end, and then would just happen to go back to where the kilns were and open them up and see these assemblages that he made. And it's funny, I saw this photograph and I thought about them in relation to what I had been doing too, and it was nice to see that these things were still, I was able to find this photograph because no one really knows about these works. So I've been making ceramics since I was 12 years old, and through high school I participated in a portfolio development program at Craft Alliance Center for Art and Design in St. Louis. And I wanted to go to college. I learned about college, and I only applied to 2 schools. I applied to the Kansas City Art Institute and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. School of the Art Institute of Chicago told me that I might not be smart enough, so I'd have to take 5 years. And I was like, whoa, I don't know if I could go to school for 5 years. And then Jonah Criswell called me and offered me a full tuition scholarship to the Kansas City Art Institute, and that was kind of it. I kind of pissed my pants on the bus. I was heading to the ceramic studio, and he called me and he said, I got some good news. And I said, what is it? Then I found myself at the Art Institute, and this is a photograph of me and my colleagues in the course of, in the spring semester, making towers with Steve Whitaker. And that's Steve. That's Steve right there. After that, I went to New York City with the infamous and famous Russell Ferguson, and me and 6 other colleagues traveled all up and down the Manhattan Island and saw basically anything and everything that we could, seeing the Alexander McQueen exhibition before it closed at the Met, learned what Chelsea art galleries were, and also took the Staten Island Ferry across this water to see the Statue of Liberty. But while getting to New York, I never flew on an airplane before, and so I saw the partitioning of the ground by the roads. And flying into New York with Delta from St. Louis into LaGuardia, you kind of see the expanse of the island and the city sprawling across the distance. And so I thought about how could I join these experiences of what I was dealing with when experiencing the land being sectioned and the buildings protruding off the ground. And so I created these constructed perspective drawings of the buildings flattened, but also the land partitioned. Then I returned and I entered the Kansas City Art Institute ceramics department. On the left is the kiln room, and on the right is the rest of the studio spaces. And this is kind of where the education in the foundation school made you realize who you were, and you became an artist from the first day entering. When you enter the ceramics department, it's a compounded experience where you then focus on the self. Well, hopefully you experience and deal with reflection into who you are, and the work that proceeds year after year becomes more reflective, more complicated, and more rich from that that institution of growing not only as an individual, but with a collective of people around you. I'm gonna skip ahead 2 years in my time and show you some wall structures that I made, thinking back to those drawings that I made when I was studying in New York City and working in a studio. I thought about the tile. The course was called Layered Narratives. At the time, Carrie Esser, the chair, she shared the what you get, the syllabus. And I didn't understand what that meant. So I just wanted to make stuff. And so I started making these. And I didn't learn what layered narratives was until the end of the course. But at least I learned something and I got a ton of work out of the experience. The first set of tiles is me carving into the surface and building structures and using glazes to have textures on top of the flat two-dimensional plane. These tiles are addressed with a certain texture construction used by hammering a chisel into tiles over and over. Instead of painting waves to signify water, I used the undulation of the carving and the pressing into the tiles to think about the water, and the kind of like a self-made map, like a kind of abstract East Coast and Northwestern Africa and Southwestern Europe, just as a way to play, because I had just got back from Hungary and I was always looking at the map. And soon to come to find out, I would study in Hungary for 7 months. But before going there, I went to Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos. And this is one of my images that I'm going to share from Bangkok. In Bangkok, there's a lot of construction, but there's also a lot of halted construction. So a lot of buildings are covered with these green tarps that act as skins on these large buildings with structures underneath them. And I add this in here, not necessarily because it's something that I'm going to use and reference in my work, but it's just an experience I want to share with everybody when I give my artist lectures. This is an image of the interior courtyard at the International Ceramic Studio. I worked there and studied with George Timmock in 2012, and then I returned in 2017 for 7 months. We fired this wood kiln one time. When I got there, it was brutally cold. It was snowing. It was crazy. I didn't know what I was doing or what was going on. I didn't know what I was going to make, but I told myself that I'm going to make something that no one ever made before. But, that's all good and nice or whatever. But I was searching for something specific, and I ended up adding everything that I could find into a kind of makeshift mold that then would make these large blocks filled with found objects, personal objects, rice, paper, whatever I could find. And then I would cut the object after it's fired to 1,300 degrees with a masonry saw. And so what you're seeing in these images is the cavities and crevices of objects that I burned away through the process of firing ceramics in the kiln. I used it as a way to imbue all these things that I had been touching into these objects that were quite abstract. And this is another one. If you ever want to see one of these pieces in person, you can make an appointment with Carrie Esser or Casey Whittier or Paul Donnelly, and you can go to the teaching collection at the Kansas City Art Institute. You can see this one. This one lives in Kansas City. This is one of my favorites. You can see the porcelaneous material on the bottom and a stoneware material above. That's the inside, and this is the outside. The red, the yellow, and the blue are all applied colors. The rest of the colors in the object are all from the transformation in the kiln. And so the reds and oranges on the right side, I kind of put everything inside, wood, plastics. It was kind of dangerous, but it worked out, and and I learned something, and this is the foundation and the beginning of making those works that are downstairs in the galleries. And as I go on, I'll tell you how I got to where we are. This is Bezalel Academy of Art and Design in Jerusalem, and this is what I saw out of my apartment, the 25-foot tall separation wall that Israel has built to occupy Palestine. And that was really difficult for me because my name is Kahlil, and Kahlil is Arabic, and it's a very prominent name in in Arabic and in Arab cultures and communities. So I was in a place where I knew nothing about that. I mean, I only knew that I'm named after Kahlil Gibran. My father's name was Gibran, my name's Kahlil, and that was kind of it. I read the Prophet every now and then, but then you really don't know anything unless, like, because I was born here. And when I went to Israel, that kind of like, shoop, it like shifted my perspective on who I am and how I operate in the world. These are some sculptures that I made. The one on the left has included sand from the Red Sea. And then through some of the other works, there's the sand from the Mediterranean Sea. And I did do some dangerous stuff in Israel. This is the bottom of my Converse shoe right here inside of this piece. I tell you, do not do this at any school. Do not do it. I was fortunate because there was a huge snowstorm that hit Jerusalem it was the worst in like history, like in 120 years. It shut down Jerusalem for like a week and a half. So my work was in the kiln and it was firing through the storm. So no one, there was no one had to deal with whatever was going on in the studio. This is another view. The wood is quite expensive in Israel, so I've used all this material found on the schools, like in the schools like area. And the bricks have like this signage that's certifying it as a well-made Israeli cinder block. So I was like, well, I'll put that information in there too. This is the other bottom of my Converse shoe right here. And I was thinking about the landscape, what was available to the students in Israel, and then how could I really invest myself and participate as if I was really a student at Bezalel. So I bought all the clay that they bought, and I did the things that they do, and I don't speak any Hebrew, so that was like really the only difference. I eat falafel with them every day, so I felt like I was a part of the group. This is a passing image of my time visiting Ramallah, Jericho, Hebron, just a huge tour through the West Bank. Okay, that's half. Now to the second half. This is an image of Delftware ceramics from the Netherlands. This is called garniture. Learning about garniture will further inform other works that I'm making. But in the museum downstairs, in the galleries, you can see that works have a blue flower decoration on the surface. I'm thinking through ceramics as a kind of a historical trajectory, not just a material that's present that I can make things from, but that there's a whole slew of other people and other things happening or that has happened in the past as an impetus of how I kind of deal with what's going on today. These are Sèvres porcelain vases. So these are made in France, but they have elephants on them as if they're Asian porcelains, and they have this like really weird motif, or these motifs on the surface. These actually live at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, if you'd like to see them. And then these are some Japanese Amari vases from the 18th century. See the connection? Do you see a relationship of the two sets that I shared at first to this one? For me, that's quite interesting, and I wonder why that is and what makes that relationship happen. Like, what made Europeans really want to have porcelain in Europe? What made, I forget his name, but the person who started the Meissen factory in Dresden in 1710, what really forced him to want to have hard-paste porcelain and produce objects that look like, that would spawn the production of objects that look like this and this, stemming from a history of porcelain production in China and Japan and Korea that looks similar to this. I don't know. So I came back to the Kansas City Art Institute from studying abroad, and I would look at stuff on the street, and I was like, well, I could go collect that stuff before it got in the drain. But instead of collecting stuff, I started slip casting objects and slip dipping things in paper cups and stuff in clay, and then firing the cups away because they were paper that's less toxic. I tried to do right, try to have a healthy studio practice. I started to slip cast styrofoam food containers, to-go containers, soda bottles, and cans. I would amass these objects and I would throw my scraps in cardboard boxes, and then somehow it turned into a piece. I think I just got enough stuff in there that then it became a work. The work is decorated with porcelain enamel. Some people call it China paint. I'm trying to reconfigure my mind to not necessarily deal or operate in the same way we've inherited from our colonialist past. So calling things China paint or China in your dish cabinet is really problematic, because it's not Chinese people sitting in your cabinet with these white dishes. It's porcelaneous or clay objects sitting that you can or maybe not eat off of because your grandmother says don't take them out or touch them because they're family heirlooms. But there's some way that I have to figure in my mind, even thinking about Oriental rugs, it's not Oriental rugs. They're woven objects made by people on hours and hours and hours. And how do we really address the issues of racism within our culture? This is another process photograph of me applying red iron oxide decals, or iron decals that look red on the surface of one of my pieces. And this is what it looks like finished. This is called Fat City Covered in the Sauce. Fat City is the kind of aspect of the St. Louis food magazine talking about food. And then the sauce is the Kansas City. Well, now it's like all Midwestern food talk in the area. This is so I use enamels, decals, and lusters. And this is an image of the way I send my decals to the decal printing company in Georgia. So I construct patterns, use found images. This in the middle is fried chicken, if you didn't know. The paisley on the top and the roses on the bottom. These images have personal significance and cultural significance, and then they get applied to objects like this one. This is called collage mess. This is the surface on top of the food box. The fried chicken patterning is applied to look similar to kind of like a very rough image that you can't really make out what it is. It's kind of a patchwork, filled in with silver, gold, roses. The idea or the relationship of text on the object, where I applied it to maybe it looks like, oh, maybe this is just covered in a whole bunch of stuff. We can take that off and then we can see what this says. But then I really thought about this work and realized that it's also about scale. The work that I made before was abstract. It could be almost any scale. This work we have a physical relationship to because we have an idea of the size of that food box. We have a somewhat understanding of the size of a soda bottle. So it's not something that could be an immersive landscape, but this is actually carved from something or coming from a specific place, compacted like a trash pile in a dump. And this work is called Popular Mass. From one side, it looks one way, and then from the other side, there's more information. And this is another one. Really trying to I made these works at one time. I showed them, I shared and talked about them, and then I took them to my apartment, hid them away a little bit, and then I took them back to the studio, and then that's where I kind of breathed all the decoration, all the physical information on the surfaces. And it took I took 4 months to make them, and then I took another 6 to 8 months to decorate all of them, and it was a series of 7 to 8 objects. Moving to St. Louis for graduate school, I was confronted with a whole lot more things, working with Professor Denise Ward Brown. This is, I named a piece Before and After Sundown, Town, in relation to living in the States, dealing with racism, and living not too far away from a town called Anna, Illinois. And Anna, Illinois is an acronym for what you can read on this Wikipedia screenshot. At the same time, my colleagues in Columbia, Missouri were protesting the student government and saying how you're treating us is inappropriate and we're not going to deal with it. Their group was called Concerned Student 1950, or the Johnson Family Reunion. or no, just Concerned Student 1950. I titled a work of mine called Concerned Student 1950, or the Johnson Family Reunion. And the situations of what's going on around me really kind of comes into the work and dealing with how to read or how a situation is progressing, and then how things are kind of responded to or created around them. So I embed this iconography or newspapers around these situations into my work. So it's not necessarily legible at first glance, but it's within the work. It's within the construction of what's going on in those objects, like the piece downstairs called Stacked, Stilted, and Shelved. Even though it's just blue and white, there's so much more going on in that piece than what you see. So I was seeing a lot of things in graduate school. That's like a before and after, unfortunately. But what does it really mean to live in a place like St. Louis with a certain relationship with it moving, coming, and going like I've had, to really kind of get to the grounding to understand who I am and what I'm doing in my practice? These soda bottles were made in 2013. This is a piece of that one called Fat City covered in the sauce. It got embedded in this recent work because it broke in shipping. So I kind of reuse, recycle, or upcycle materials or objects. On the surface, you can see a new pattern that I made out of cigarette butts. Michael Brown is memorialized in my work here. The short title of this work is In Remembrance, or In Memorial of, I think. I can't remember. Kind of moved so fast making this work. Bruce got to see this work in progress. I don't know if he's got to see it finished. And so I used a lot of images from St. Louis. I used newspapers from California, Missouri, and New York to add to the surface of these objects. And then slips, it's like glazed and unglazed porcelain and stoneware, slip cast objects, like a really groggy terracotta slip that I was using, or red clay slip, blue slip, clear glaze. Mostly the glaze that I use in the studio now is all clear glaze. Any colors that are applied are either through colored slips, decals, enamels, lusters. This is an image of the installation, or one installation view of the work at Callicoon Fine Arts in New York City. It's I think like a 12-foot by 15 or 17-foot wall vinyl. That's the title of the exhibition was Streets, Chains, Cocktails. And so I thought, well, shoot, let's address the wall. And I made these really big prints that you'll see later that I was going to put on top of that wall. But then I thought, no. When you're dealing with fencing, that means that there's a barrier there and that you cannot enter or pass through this space. You literally have to walk around this wall, or this idea of a wall that I'm presenting in the gallery, to get to the other side. I should have put some more details in this. And this is a work on paper that you see and you're confronted by when you turn that wall of the chain link fence. This is the image of that print that's framed. This is an image of St. Louis, one side of St. Louis, that many people don't necessarily see that often. But there's, like, similar to Kansas City, there are over 10,000 vacant lots and 8,000 empty buildings. How do we think about revitalization or reorganizing the environments in which we live in and still address the issues, but grow collectively, and not just continuing to do what we've done through history or what we know of our imperialist and colonialist past? Thanks.
Who's going to break the ice and ask a question? Thank you.
On your dirt ride, do you have that kind of diagrammed out ahead of time, kind of, so you know what you're going to do, or is it just kind of come as you go?
Yes. It's carefully planned ahead of time. Once I've cut apart all of the shoe pieces, I scan them, create a digital rendering of each one. So then I have an alphabet of patterns from all the different shoe pieces, and I take those individual patterns and arrange them digitally in Illustrator to create the overall pattern of the rug. And so each of the individual patterns that make up the pattern of the rug are designs that I've come up with, and some of them reference specific plants or animals, some of them reference agriculture or industry. There's a language of symbols that largely relate to this interaction of the human and or the natural and the man-made world. And so all of the symbols that I'm using, whether they're floral patterns or they look like animals or oil wells or what have you, relate to that relationship. And as I'm making the rug, I'm referring to that pattern or blueprint.
For both artists, what do you do with the dirt when you're done with the project? And then for the other artists, I noticed you have like a newsprint. It looked like it was fired onto the surface. How do you do that without the images burning up?
Right now I have about 42 buckets, 5-gallon Home Depot buckets of soil sitting in my studio. And so I take them back to Oklahoma and I'll use them to create another installation, although eventually I imagine that the soil will be returned to the landscape in one way or another.
Is your studio on the first floor?
Yeah.
Can you tell me what what specifically you're thinking about? Like which images?
Well, the text appeared to be from like the newspapers and labels. How do you manage to get those onto the ceramic surface?
So I'm gonna take you like 5 seconds through the whole process. I make the pieces. I put them into the kiln, fire them to 1,945 degrees. Then I take them and glaze them, and then I fire them to 2,400 degrees, basically. And then I get them out, and I look at them, and then I have materials, the luster, the enamels, and the decals. They're all fired at different temperatures. The black luster that I love, it's fired much hotter than the decals, per se, or the red, whatever. Anything red fires really, really low. So if I want to get a decal that has red imagery in it, newspaper, certain commercial decals that are printed, I have to fire them really, really low too. So I get the images, like that big sheet that I had with roses and fried chicken on it. I send it to a company, and they send me back my sheet. I cut out what I want and how I want it to look on the ceramic. I cut it out, put it in a little bit of water, slide it onto the glazed surface, and then I put the object back into the kiln, and depending on what decal company I used, they regulate what temperature I need to fire it to. So it could be 1,627 degrees. And so I get cones to look at when I'm firing my decals, my lusters and enamels, and I look into the kiln at that temperature to make sure that when the computer's reading 1627, my cone for 1627 is also curled over. And then I can make sure that's how the imagery stays on there. And no like solvents or anything. Like I'm not adding any polyurethane to like stick that stuff. It's all embodied into the ceramic.
It looks like that, so that's
I'm glad. Cause yeah.
it was on the surface and glued on. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, sir. Oh. No, you go ahead.
No, I was going to ask what the longevity of one of those rugs is. If you know, if they stayed in a place for X number of months. I know they're meant to be destroyed, swept up. But I'm just sort of interested in the fact that they may stay looking where you want.
They've been installed anywhere from a week to months at a time. I imagine that if no one really disturbed it, and there wasn't a lot of seismic activity or something, or a leaky ceiling or something, that it would last a long time. I think probably it would start to settle a little bit.
Well, is the surface a little more firm than soil would be? I know you imprint it and you use a trowel on it, and I was wondering if it was a little more stable. I guess that's kind of what I want to say. Is it rather than being out on a path? I don't know.
Yeah,
I know what it's like there.
It's a clay-rich soil, so it has a certain weight to it. But imagine spreading out flour on your countertop and then making an impression in that. That's what it's like. It's just very loose, and if you blow on it or spread your fingers across it, you'll make a mark. So it's really loose, really malleable.
Yes, I was wondering, can you recall anything particularly memorable or unusual that you found physically as you were harvesting the soil? And if so, does that ever inform what it ends up looking like when you put it together?
Most of the soil that I gather is just like, it started out just on the side of the road or a construction project or a farming project. So, it's everywhere. You can find a pile of red dirt really easily. And then to do the large piece, I purchased soil from a place that sells sand and gravel and dirt, and it's really just dirt when I get it. And I haven't found anything aside from bugs and sticks and rocks. But it's funny, I sit there kind of sifting the soil for hours and hours, and sometimes my fellow residents of my program would come and check on me, and one of my friends came in at one point and asked, "Have you found anything yet?" And I realized it looked like I was like siphoning, searching for something, and it was just kind of nice to think about, like, I'm not discovering objects or crystals or rings or anything, but I'm definitely searching.
Kahlil, I might ask you the same question. Are you finding anything odd in the things you've had that move your work as a result of accidental discoveries?
I think, well, yeah, there was one time in Hungary, when I lived there for so long, I put a steel can in my piece and I didn't know what was going on. I just put it in there and just said, we're gonna fire it up. I take it out the biscuit kiln, glaze it up. Wow, okay, bam, it's ready to go to high fire. Cool, fired to 1,300 degrees Celsius. That's really hot. Much hotter than standard studios, ceramic pottery studios in the United States is going. So I was like, okay, let's do it. I opened the kiln, I tried to pick the piece up off the shelf. I'm like, man, this piece won't come off the shelf. And I had put the steel can in there, not understanding that the steel melts at a lower temperature than the porcelain I was firing, so it created a glaze on the surface of the object. But the steel can was not there anymore. It was there only on the impression of the porcelain. So there was a circular object with the void of a can, but the can was still present in some kind of way. So that was pretty interesting. But other than that, I'm really trying to search. I'm really searching for a freedom that may not be present. And I think in the next place, after I've made this exhibition in New York and I've made this work downstairs, now the new work might be that place of how to present the freedom that I've always been wanting in this this working in such abstract way. Maybe the work now will be to scale. Porcelain and ceramic, anything clay, when it's fired, it shrinks. So maybe I will make things to where when it fires, it doesn't shrink less than the scale that we know it as, but that it's made to to the scale that we know it as, and then that we can have a real relationship with those things, even though, or the imagery, we can have a new relationship with the imagery on the objects. Yeah, I think that's like kind of where I'm at, because the free, the liberated, like what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be liberated? What does it mean to be from Earth and not from the United States necessarily, like just I'm from the USA, you know, or I'm from Great Britain, or I'm from blah, 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 you know, like what if we're from Earth and I can just travel from place to place and just experience the whole land in which we live on? And I want that to be in the work too.
Kind of following up his question, do you find when you go and collect things that you're going to put in to make these abstract shapes that you're creating, do you find there are different things in, I mean, you've done a lot of traveling, obviously, which is great. Sounds wonderful.
A lot of grant money.
So, are there different, we had a discussion with the clay artist just the other day in Topeka about there was another artist there that does installation stuff. She was bemoaning the fact that there wasn't a lot of trash around Topeka. There wasn't, she wasn't finding interesting trash. And I'm just wondering if you find there be differences in different places you've been, and do you put that, is that in the work?
Well, guess what? I'm glad you asked that. I just got back from Hungary for 2.5 months working at the University of Page, and I made objects in the studio there. And so some of the paper and some of the stuff that I have from my time there will be embedded in decorating those objects. So that that there will be a certain amount of that experience still contextualizing that object through the title, through the imagery, through the material specifically, like the enamels that I buy and the lusters that I use, except cheap gold luster and silver luster here in the States. All of my lusters, all of my enamels, all come from Hungary. So it's like, it's already, you know, it's like there. But finding interesting trash. So I started doing this printmaking project where I call it Street Views, and I try to make paper look like asphalt, look like the street. And so I use Sintra as a matrix, and I like stomp on it on the street, and people look at me funny because like, what's this guy doing outside, like stomping on this white thing? And then I take the texture of the road, and then I take it into the studio, and I ink it up and add found objects on the surface. I don't own a car, so I walk to and from the studio or to and from school, and so I would find a myriad of things on the road. Soda cans, like in the big piece, the big red bow. That big red bow is actually me inking up the bow and putting it on the plate and taking it off and not gluing it to the paper. So it's a representation of that bow. And so really interesting things. I found Chinese cigarette box, Chinese cigarettes. There's a lot of Asian students, Chinese students that go to Washington University in St. Louis. I mean, almost every school in the United States has a lot of, a strong population of international Asian students. And so I was like, okay, this Chinese cigarette box. And then I put that right next to an unfolded Chinese food box, American Chinese food box from from down the street. So I can create these relationships between these things that may not have any relationship at all, but it's kind of this constructed environment or this reality with this thing. I think I create the interesting, not necessarily that I'm like gonna find it, but I can make it. I think I can make it.
I have a question for Kahlil.
I'm doing a lot of talking.
Yeah. So I know that you're involved in a lot of arts activism in St. Louis and other places. What do you feel like in these politically charged times, like what can we do as artists to affect change with some of the major issues that we're confronted with?
Well, I think for black people in America, in minorities, it's always been a politically charged time. Mm-hmm. So for most of the artists I know, it's always been a kind of a searching and a longing for a kind of time for relaxation. what I took this class in undergrad with Reed Anderson in art history called The Artist's Role in Society. And through this course, we kind of went through all of the things that people have done in the past. And I think about like all the things that people have done in the past, how can that inform what we do today? And for me, it's hard to tell people like we got to be informed, because it's like if you get the wrong information from the wrong place or what you think is the right place, then you think you're informed. So that's not a good avenue. Just going around and you're necessarily being right and doing right and being a good person, that also might not work, because you might think hatred is a good thing and you're doing the right things, and then that's not a good avenue. It's difficult. It's really hard. Because when there's a situation that happened at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, and they exhibited an artist's works that were completely devoid of any criticality that everybody, like what they were having against everybody else's work, like thinking through everyone else's work. But they didn't have the same criticality towards this work that they were presenting, and they thought that bringing this work that reconstructed images of torment and terror in the United States was a way of like dealing with, we're gonna have a conversation because now this artwork's up. And I'm like, that's not necessarily, like you got, like the artwork has to work and operate right for then to have that right conversation. So I just say like, having people who are invested in similar and like-minded things, like getting to that progressive point, like getting to that point past something that we're all angling through, and working with those people and staying true with those people and continuing that practice, I think the community is like kind of how we get to that place of recognizing what and how we can do things to get forward. Because before we can do anything to do better, the community we have to do better together before we can think about how we can fix anything. Right. Thank you. Mr. Jones?
Yeah, I have a question for both artists. In listening to both of you talk about your work, I sort of did my own little compare and contrast. And I noticed a lot of similarities. Both of you have, done gathering and use of found objects in the work. You're both using clay, yet in completely different ways. And the works are based on historical events in American history. And then the biggest difference is one of you is making work that's meant to be permanent, a permanent recognition of certain things, and then a temporary life also. So my question is, have either of you noticed those similarities, and what can you take from the other in noticing each other's work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I definitely have noticed those similarities, and that's one of the really exciting things about showing work with other artists and working with curators, is that you get to experience your work in relation to other people's work, and often you get a greater understanding of your work through that. This idea of a permanent object or an ephemeral object is something that I'm always thinking about in my own work, and I sometimes do make permanent objects too, but I'm really interested in the ephemeral object, and one of the reasons for that is because of the way that we assign value to things. So with this work, with the red dirt rug work, so much of it is influenced by how we humans, or specifically Americans, or doesn't really matter, assign value to land, and through that all kinds of things happen. And so I'm interested in kind of removing that in a way, like making an object that you really want it to be permanent. You want to put that in your house, or see it last. It's really beautiful, but knowing that it isn't going to last, or that it has that temporary quality. And a lot of people have told me, you should think of a way to make this permanent so that you can sell them and support yourself. And there's something to that, and I haven't quite figured that out yet. But with this work, it was totally changed the concept of the piece for me. I wouldn't do that. I may make a different work, but I don't know if that quite answers your question. Maybe I'll still think about it.
Can you ask your question one more time? Just the question.
Basically, based on the similarities in doing a compare and contrast of each other's work, what can you take from the other? And I think the question would be based in the permanent nature of your work and the temporary nature of Rena's work.
So when I look at her work, I really think about the styrofoam food box and how it is a permanent thing, and I'm translating it into ceramic material. All of the things that I think I'm making molds of and using are objects that will still last forever because of the original object's material history. And I think thinking about her work in relationship to my own, it's all about a time and a kind of experience of when I'm going to and from a place. And so the impermanence of the work is my experience of making the things that then is embodied in the objects. I don't think that I will, in the near future, I don't see myself making anything that's like gonna deteriorate with water. I'm not gonna ever not think about firing my pieces, because that's also a part of the history of like what I'm trying to get at with the work. And I think the best similarity between us is that we're both, we're scrolling through history and mining from the canon and of objects making in the past and using processes and practices and objects as an impetus to get to this other place. That she's thinking through rug making, and the material then adds meaning to that object. And me the same. And it's almost like her dirt rugs have to be dirt. My porcelain objects have to be made out of porcelain, because then they are consecrated through a permanence in a way of not only our experiences of making the things, but they're consecrated through other people's experiences of those things. So even though they may go and live somewhere else or be swept up into buckets, we think and talk about them as impermanent and permanent, but in the end, they really are still permanent because experience is still like within us.